This is an audiobook for Stephen King's The Dark Tower series, continuing with Book 2, The Drawing of the Three. Part 1, The Prisoner. Chapter 3, Contact and Landing. Like I've done before, due to time, I'm going to split this chapter in half. 1. Eddie was awakened by an announcement from the co-pilot that they should be landing at Kennedy International, where the visibility was unlimited, the winds out of the west at 10 miles an hour, and the temperature a jolly 70 degrees in 45 minutes or so. He told them that, if he didn't get another chance, he wanted to thank them, one and all, for choosing Delta. He looked around and saw people checking their duty declarations cards and their proofs of citizenship. Coming in from Nassau, your driver's license and a credit card with a stateside bank listed on it was supposed to be enough, but most still carried passports. And Eddie felt a steel wire start to tighten inside him. He still couldn't believe he had gone to sleep, and so soundly. He got up and went to the restroom. The bags of coke under his arms felt as if they were resting easily and firmly, fitting as nicely to the contours of his sides as they had in the hotel room where a soft-spoken American named William Wilson had strapped them on. Following the strapping operation, the man whose name Poe had made famous, Wilson, had only looked blankly at Eddie when Eddie made some allusion to this. Handed over the shirt. Just an ordinary paisley shirt, a little faded, the sort of thing any frat boy might wear back on the plane following a short pre-exams holiday, except this one was specially tailored to hide unsightly bulges. You check everything once before you set down, just to be sure, Wilson said, but you're gonna be fine. Eddie didn't know if he was going to be fine or not, but he had another reason for wanting to use the John before the fasten seatbelts light came on. In spite of all temptation, and most of last night it hadn't been temptation but raging need, he had managed to hold on to the last little bit of what the sallow thing had the temerity to call China White. Clearing customs from Nassau wasn't like clearing customs from Haiti or Bogota. But there were still people watching, trained people. He needed any and every edge he could get. If he could go in there a little cooled out, just a little, it might be the one thing that put him over the top. He snorted the powder, flushed the little twist of paper it had been in down the john, then washed his hands. Of course, if you make it, you'll never know, will you? He thought. No, he wouldn't, and wouldn't care. On his way back to his seat, he saw the stewardess who had brought him the drink he hadn't finished. She smiled at him, he smiled, sat down, buckled his seatbelt, took out the flight magazine, turned the pages, and looked at the pictures and words. Neither made any impression on him. That steel wire continued to tighten around his gut, and when the fasten seatbelts light did come on, it took a double turn and cinched tight. The heroin had hit. He had the sniffles to prove it, but he sure couldn't feel it. One thing he did feel shortly before landing was another of those unsettling periods of blankness, short, but most definitely there. The 727 banked over the water of Long Island Sound and started in. 2. Jane Dorning had been in the business class galley, helping Peter and Anne stow the last of the after-meal drinks glasses when the guy who looked like a college kid went into the first-class bathroom. He was returning to his seat when she brushed aside the curtain between business and first, and she quickened her step without even thinking about it, catching him with her smile, making him look up and smile back. His eyes were hazel again. All right, all right. He went into the John and took them out before his nap. He went into the John and put them in again afterwards. For Christ's sake, Janie, you're being a goose. She wasn't, though. It was nothing she could put her finger on, but she was not being a goose. He's too pale. So what? Thousands of people are too pale, including her own mother since her gallbladder went to hell. He had very arresting blue eyes, maybe not as cute as the hazel contacts, but certainly arresting. So why the bother and expense? Because he likes designer eyes. Isn't that enough? No. Shortly before fasten seatbelts and final cross-check, she did something she had never done before. She did it with that tough, old battle axe of an instructor in mind. She filled a thermos bottle with hot coffee and put on the red plastic top without first pushing the stopper into the bottle's throat. She screwed the top on only until she felt it catch the first thread. Susie Douglas was making the final approach announcement, telling the geese to extinguish their cigarettes, telling them they would have to stow what they had taken out, telling them that a Delta Gate agent would meet the flight, telling them to check and make sure they had their duty declarations cards and proofs of citizenship, telling them it would now be necessary to pick up all cups, glasses, and speaker sets. I'm surprised we don't have to To make sure they're dry, Jane thought distractedly. She felt her own steel wire wrapping itself around her guts, cinching them tight. Get my side, Jane said as Susie hung up the mic. Susie glanced at the thermos, then at Jane's face. Jane, are you sick? You look as white as a... I'm not sick. Get my side. I'll explain when you get back. Jane glanced briefly at the jump seats beside the left-hand exit door. I want to ride shotgun. Jane, get my side. All right, Susie said. All right, Jane. No problem. Jane Dorning sat down in the jump seat closest to the aisle. She held the thermos in her hands and made no move to fasten the web harness. She wanted to keep the thermos in complete control, and that meant both hands. Susie thinks I flipped out. Jane hoped she hadn't. If Captain McDonald lands hard, I'm going to have blisters all over my hands. She would risk it. The plane was dropping. The man in 3A, the man with the two-toned eyes and the pale face, suddenly leaned down and pulled his traveling bag from under the seat. This is it, Jane thought. This is where he brings out the grenade or the automatic weapon or whatever the hell he's got. And the moment she saw it, the very moment, she was going to flip the red top off the thermos in her slightly trembling hands, and there was going to be one very surprised friend of Allah rolling around on the aisle floor of Delta Flight 901 while his skin boiled on his face. 3A unzipped the bag. Jane got ready. 3. The gunslinger thought this man, prisoner or not, was probably better at the fine art of survival than any of the other men he had seen in the air carriage. The others were fat things, for the most part, and even those who looked reasonably fit also looked open, unguarded, their faces those of spoiled and cosseted children. The faces of men who would fight, eventually, but who would whine almost endlessly before they did. You could let their guts out onto their shoes, and their last expression would not be rage or agony, but stupid surprise. The prisoner was better, but not good enough. Not at all. The army woman, she saw something. I don't know what, but she saw something wrong. She's awake to him in a way she's not to the others. The prisoner sat down. He looked at a limp-covered book he thought of as a Magda scene. Although who Magda might have been or what she might have seen mattered not a whit to Roland. The gunslinger did not want to look at a book, amazing as such things were. He wanted to look at the woman in the army uniform. The urge to come forward and take control was very great, but he held against it, at least for the time being. The prisoner had gone somewhere and gotten a drug. Not the drug he himself took, nor the one that would help cure the gunslinger's sick body, but the one people paid a lot of money for because it was against the law. He would have given this drug to his brother, who would in turn give it to a man named Balazar. The deal would be complete when Balazar traded them the kind of drug they took for this one. If that was, the prisoner was able to correctly perform a ritual unknown to the gunslinger, and a world as strange as this must of necessity have many strange rituals. It was called clearing the customs. But the woman sees him. Could she keep him from clearing the customs? Roland thought the answer was probably yes. And then, jail. And if the prisoner were jailed, there would be no place to get the sort of medicine his infected, dying body needed. He must clear the customs, Roland thought. He must, and he must go with his brother to this man Balazar. It's not in the plan. The brother won't like it, but he must. Because a man who dealt in drugs would either know a man or be a man who also cured the sick. A man who could listen to what was wrong and then, maybe, he must clear the customs, the gunslinger thought. The answer was so large and simple, so close to him, that he very nearly did not see it at all. It was the drug the prisoner meant to smuggle in that would make clearing the customs so difficult, of course. There must be some sort of oracle who might be consulted in the case of people who seemed suspicious. Otherwise, Roland gleaned, the clearing ceremony would be simplicity itself, as crossing a friendly border was in his own world. One made the sign of fealty to that kingdom's monarch, a simple token gesture, and was allowed to pass. He was able to take things from the prisoner's world to his own. The Tudorfish Pumpkin proved that. He would take the bags of drugs as he had taken the popkin. The prisoner would clear the customs, and then Roland would bring the bags of drugs back. Can you? Here was a question disturbing enough to distract him from the view of the water below. They had gone over what looked like a huge ocean, and were now turning back toward the coastline. As they did, the water grew steadily closer. The air carriage was coming down. Eddie's glance was brief, cursory. The gunslinger's as rapt as the child seeing his first snowfall. He could take things from this world, that he knew, but bring them back again? That was a thing of which he as yet had no knowing. He would have to find out. The gunslinger reached into the prisoner's pocket and closed the prisoner's fingers over a coin. Roland went back through the door. 4. The birds flew away when he sat up. They hadn't dared come as close this time. He ached. He was woozy, feverish. Yet it was amazing how much even a little bit of nourishment had revived him. He looked at the coin he had brought back with him this time. It looked like silver, but the reddish tint at the edge suggested it was really made of some baser metal. On one side was a profile of a man whose face suggested nobility, courage, stubbornness. His hair, both curled at the base of the skull and pigged at the nape of the neck, suggested a bit of vanity as well. He turned the coin over and saw something so startling it caused him to cry out in a rusty, croaking voice. On the back was an eagle, the device which had decorated his own banner in those dim days when there had still been kingdoms and banners to symbolize them. Time's short. Go back. Hurry. But as he tarried a moment longer thinking, it was harder to think inside this head. The prisoner's was far from clear, but it was, temporarily at least, a cleaner vessel than his own. To try the coin both ways was only half the experiment, wasn't it? He took one of the shells from his cartridge belt and folded it over the coin in his hand. Roland stepped back through the door. 5. The prisoner's coin was still there, firmly curled within the pocketed hand. He didn't have to come forward to check on the shell. He knew it hadn't made the trip. He came forward anyway, briefly, because there was one thing he had to know, had to see. So he turned, as if to adjust the little paper thing on the back of his seat. By all the gods that ever were, there was paper everywhere in this world, and looked through the doorway. He saw his body collapsed as before, now with a fresh trickle of blood flowing from a cut on his cheek. A stone must have done it when he let himself and crossed over. The cartridge he had been holding, along with the coin, lay at the base of the door on the sand. Still, enough was answered. The prisoner could clear the customs. Their guards a watch might search him from head to toe, from asshole to appetite and back again. They would find nothing. The gunslinger settled back, content, unaware, at least for the time being, that he still had not grasped the extent of his problem. 6. The 727 came in low and smooth over the salt marshes of Long Island, leaving sooty trails of spent fuel behind. The landing gear came down with a rumble and a thump. 7. 3A, the man with the two-tone eyes, straightened up, and Jane actually saw a snub-nosed Uzi in his hands before she realized it was nothing but his duty declarations card and a little zipper bag of the sort which men sometimes use to hold their passports. The plane settled like silk. Letting out a deep, shaking shudder, she tightened the red top on the thermos. "Call me an asshole," she said in a low voice to Susie, buckling the cross belt. Now that it was too late, she had told Susie what she suspected on the final approach, so Susie would be ready. "You have every right." "No," Susie said. "You did the right thing. I overreacted, and dinner's on me." "Like hell it is, and don't look at him. Look at me. Smile, Janie." Jane smiled, nodded, wondered what in God's name was going on now. "You were watching his hands," Susie said, and laughed. Jane joined in. "I was watching what happened to his shirt when he bent over to get his bag. He's got enough stuff under there to stock a Woolsworth notions counter, only I don't think he's carrying the kind of stuff you can buy at Woolsworth." Jane threw back her head and laughed again, feeling like a puppet. How do we handle it? Susie had 5 years seniority on her, and Jane, who only a minute ago had felt she had the situation under some desperate kind of control, now only felt glad to have Susie beside her. "We don't. Tell the captain while we're taxiing in. The captain speaks to customs. Your friend there gets in line like everyone else, except when he gets pulled out of line with some men who escort him to a little room. It's going to be the first in a very long succession of little rooms for him, I think." Jesus, Jane was smiling, but chills, alternately hot and cold, were racing through her. She hit the pop release on her harness when the reverse thrusters began to wind down, handed the thermos to Susie, then got up and rapped on the cockpit door. Not a terrorist, but a drug smuggler. Thank God for small favors, yet in a way she hated it. He had been cute. Not much, but a little. 8. He still doesn't see, the gunslinger thought with anger and dawning desperation. Gods, Eddie had been to get the papers he needed for the ritual, and when he looked up, the army woman was staring at him, her eyes bulging, her cheeks as white as the paper things on the backs of their seats. The silver tube with the red top, which he had at first taken for some kind of canteen, was apparently a weapon. She was holding it up between her breasts now. Roland thought that in a moment or two she would either throw it or spin off the red top and shoot him with it. Then she relaxed and buckled her harness, even though the thump told both the gunslinger and the prisoner the air carriage had already landed. She turned to the army woman she was sitting with and said something. The other woman laughed and nodded, but if that was a real laugh, the gunslinger thought, he was a river toad. The gunslinger wondered how the man whose mind had become temporary home for the gunslinger's own ka could be so stupid. Some of it was what he was putting into his body, of course, one of this world's versions of devilweed. Some, but not all. He was not soft and unobservant like the others, but in time he might be. They are as they are because they live in the light, the gunslinger thought suddenly. That light of civilization you were taught to adore above all other things. They live in a world which has not moved on. If this was what people became in such a world, Roland was not sure he didn't prefer the dark. That was before the world moved on, people said in his own world, and it was always said in tones of bereft sadness. But it was, perhaps, sadness without thought, without consideration. She thought I, or he, meant to grab a weapon when he, bent down to get the papers. When she saw the papers, she relaxed and did what everyone else did before the carriage came down to the ground again. Now she and her friend are talking and laughing, but their faces, her face especially, the face of the woman with the metal tube, are not right. They are talking all right, but they are only pretending to laugh. And that is because what they are talking about is I, or him. The air carriage was now moving along what seemed a long concrete road, one of many. Mostly he watched the women, but from the edges of his vision, the gunslinger could see other air carriages moving here and there along other roads. Some lumbered, some moved with incredible speed, not like the carriages at all, but like projectiles fired from guns or cannons, preparing to leap into the air. As desperate as his own situation had become, part of him wanted very much to come forward and turn his head so he could see these vehicles as they leaped into the sky. They were man-made, but every bit as fabulous as the stories of the Grand Featherettes, which had supposedly once lived in the distant, and probably mythical, kingdom of Garland. More fabulous, perhaps, simply because these were man-made. The woman who had brought him the popkin unfastened her harness, this less than a minute since she had fastened it, and went forward to a small door. That's where the driver sits, the gunslinger thought, but when the door was opened and she stepped in, he saw it apparently took 3 drivers to operate the air carriage, and even the brief glimpse he was afforded of what seemed like a million dials and levels and lights made him understand why. The prisoner was looking at all but seeing nothing. Court would have first sneered, then driven him through the nearest wall. The prisoner's mind was completely occupied with grabbing the bag under the seat and his light jacket from the overhead bin, and facing the ordeal of the ritual. The prisoner saw nothing. The gunslinger saw everything. The woman thought him a thief or a madman. He, or perhaps it was I, yes, that's likely enough, did something to make her think that. She changed her mind, and then the other woman changed it back. Only now I think they know what's really wrong. They know he's going to try to profane the ritual. Then, in a thunderclap, he saw the rest of his problem. First, it wasn't just a matter of taking the bags into his world as he had the coin. The coin hadn't been stuck to the prisoner's body with the glue string the prisoner had wrapped around and around his upper body to hold the bags tight to his skin. This glue string was only part of his problem. The prisoner hadn't missed the temporary disappearance of one coin among many, but when he realized that whatever it was he had risked his life for was suddenly gone, he was surely going to raise the racks. And what then? It was more than possible that the prisoner would begin to behave in a manner so irrational that it would get him locked away in jail as quickly as being caught in the act of profanation. The loss would be bad enough, for the bags under his arms to simply melt away to nothing would probably make him think he really had gone mad. The air carriage, ox-like now that it was on the ground, labored its way through a left turn. The gunslinger realized that he had no time for the luxury of further thought. He had to do more than come forward. He must make contact with Eddie Dean. Right now. 9. Eddie tucked his declaration card and passport in his breast pocket. The steel wire was now turning steadily around his guts, sinking in deeper and deeper, making his nerves spark and sizzle, and suddenly a voice spoke in his head. Not a thought, a voice. Listen to me, fellow, listen carefully, and if you would remain safe, let your face show nothing, which might further rouse the suspicions of those army women. God knows they're suspicious enough already. Eddie first thought he was still wearing the airline earphones and picking up some weird transmission from the cockpit, but the airline headphones had been picked up 5 minutes ago. His second thought was that someone was standing beside him and talking. He almost snapped his head to the left, but that was absurd. Like it or not, the raw truth was that the voice had come from inside his head. Maybe he was receiving some sort of transmission, AM, FM, or VHF, on the fillings of his teeth. He had heard of such Straighten up, maggot. They're suspicious enough without you looking as if you've gone crazy. Eddie sat up fast, as if he had been whacked. That voice wasn't Henry's, but it was so much like Henry's when they had been just a couple of kids growing up in the projects. Henry, 8 years older, the sister who had been between them, now only the ghost of a memory. Selina had been struck and killed by a car when Eddie was 2 and Henry 10. The rasping tone of command came out whenever Henry saw him doing something that might end with Eddie occupying a pine box long before his time, as Selina had. What in the blue fuck is going on here? You're not hearing voices that aren't there, the voice inside his head returned. No, not Henry's voice. Older, drier, stronger, but like Henry's voice. And impossible not to believe. That's the first thing. You're not going crazy. I am another person. This is telepathy? Eddie was vaguely aware that his face was completely expressionless. He thought that, under the circumstances, that ought to qualify him for the Best Actor of the Year Academy Award. He looked out the window and saw the plane closing in on the Delta section of Kennedy's International Arrivals Building. I don't know that word, but I do know that those army women know you are carrying. There was a pause, a feeling, odder beyond telling, of phantom fingers rummaging through his brain as if he were a living card catalog. Heroin or cocaine. I can't tell which, except it must be cocaine because you're carrying the one you don't take to buy the one that you do. What army women? Eddie muttered in a low voice. He was completely unaware that he was speaking aloud. What in the hell are you talking about? That feeling of being slapped once more, so real he felt his head ring with it. Shut your mouth, you damned jackass. All right, Christ. Now that feeling of rummaging fingers again. Army stewardesses, the alien voice replied. Do you understand me? I have no time to con your every thought, prisoner. What did you? Eddie began, then shut his mouth. What did you call me? Never mind, just listen. Time is very, very short. They know. The army stewardesses know you have this cocaine. How could they? That's ridiculous. I don't know how they came by their knowledge, and it doesn't matter. One of them told the drivers. The drivers will tell whatever priests perform this ceremony, this clearing of customs. The language of the voice in his head was arcane, the terms so off kilter they were almost cute. But the message came through loud and clear. Although his face remained expressionless, Eddie's teeth came together with a painful click, and he drew a hot little hiss in through them. The voice was saying the game was over. He hadn't even gotten off the plane, and the game was already over. But this wasn't real. No way this could be real. It was just his mind doing a paranoid little jig at the last minute. That was all. He would ignore it. Just ignore it and it would go away. You will not ignore it or you will go to jail and I will die, the voice roared. Who in the name of God are you? Eddie asked reluctantly, fearfully, and inside his head he heard someone or something let out a deep and gusty sigh of relief. 10. He believes, the gunslinger thought. Thank all the gods that are or ever were. He believes. We're going to stop here, and we're going to finish 11 through 18 in the next video. Thanks for your patience.